Most people think working harder is how you build wealth or change your life. But this book proves that's exactly why they fail. They are literally fighting against their own biological machinery. Welcome to Deep Dive Audiobook English. I'm Claire, and today we're going deep into Charles Duhigg's research.
And I am Marcus.
So if you are looking for the absolute best breakdown of the power of habit audiobook, you are definitely in the right place. I mean, looking around at how overwhelmed we all are in 2026 with the constant notifications and, algorithmic feeds, understanding the invisible scripts running our lives has literally never been more urgent.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're basically swimming in this ocean of automatic behaviors, and most of us don't even realize we're drowning.
Exactly. And by the end of this deep dive, you are going to understand 3 really specific mechanical realities that will just fundamentally alter how you view your own daily actions.
Yeah.
First, you're going to understand the basal ganglia, which is this primitive neurological center deep inside your skull where your automatic behaviors actually live. Second, we're going to unpack how to properly identify and dismantle the 3-part habit loop.
Which is so crucial.
It really is. It's the invisible engine dictating your actions without your conscious permission. And third, you will walk away with the exact 4-step framework to rewrite your own neurological code.
I have to jump in right here, though, because I think a lot of people listening are going to feel a sudden wave of resistance to this. I mean, is it really just biology?
Yeah.
Like, are we actually saying that human willpower is an illusion and we are just slaves to our neural pathways? Because if I'm just a meat machine executing scripts, that sounds incredibly bleak. It kind of strips away all the poetry of human agency, doesn't it?
I get that. It's a really natural reaction to have.
Yeah.
But it's not about being a slave to biology. It's about understanding the machinery you were born with. Willpower is not this infinite reservoir of moral strength. It's actually a highly finite biological resource. Think of it like a muscle that fatigues throughout the day.
Yeah.
If you try to change your life or your business or your diet using only sheer willpower, you are going to exhaust yourself before lunchtime.
Yeah, you hit the wall at like 2 p.m.
Exactly. The research we are dissecting today shows that true change happens when you start fighting the machinery with brute force and you start systematically reprogramming it.
Which means we need to understand the manual and, who wrote it. So let's talk about Charles Duhigg. It is so crucial to understand that he isn't just some guy who decided to write a trendy self-help book.
Right. Not at all.
He was an incredibly rigorous investigative reporter for the New York Times. His entry point into this wasn't like life coaching, it was corporate autopsy.
That's a great way to put it.
He spent years observing how massive organizations failed or succeeded, and he noticed this bizarre recurring pattern. Multi-billion-dollar companies weren't failing because of bad strategy or market conditions. They were collapsing from the inside out because of toxic institutional habits.
Yeah, and what he realized was that decisions within major corporations, and really by extension with individual human lives, they were rarely being made through logical, deliberate thought.
Even though we love to think they are.
We really do. We love to believe we are rational actors making these cost-benefit analyses all day long. But we aren't. They were automatic routines. In fact, he pulled research from Duke University that actually quantified this. They found that more than 40% of the actions you perform every single day are not actual decisions.
Wow.
They are habits. 40%.
Let that sink in for a second. Almost half of your waking hours are spent on autopilot. I mean, we think you're making conscious choices about what you eat for breakfast, what exact route you take to work, how you react to an annoying email. But for 40% of your day, you are essentially a passenger in your own body, just running a pre-written script.
It's wild to think about.
But wait, let me push back again. With the self-improvement space absolutely flooded with theories on routines and morning protocols right now, why should we trust this specific framework? I mean, is this just another self-help trend?
No, and it holds up because it isn't based on anecdotal success stories. It is deeply anchored in decades of rigorous peer-reviewed neuroscience.
Like actual clinical data.
Exactly. We are looking at clinical data from MIT, massive behavioral studies from the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, and brain imaging from some of the top neuroanatomists in the world. This is not about the power of positive thinking.
Right, no manifesting here.
Yeah, exactly. This is about physical, observable changes in the structure of the brain. When a habit forms, the brain literally, physically, changes its firing patterns.
which is what makes it so incredibly practical. Over the next hour or so, we are going to walk you through the core insights from this research. We'll look at why your brain actively tries to stop thinking, how it is entirely possible to learn incredibly complex physical skills without having any conscious memory of learning them.
Which is just fascinating.
It really is. And we'll get into why tweaking just one specific type of habit can cause a biological domino effect that transforms literally everything else in your life.
We need to start at the physical epicenter of all this, though. To understand behavior, you really have to understand the hardware. Let's look at what researchers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology discovered about the brain's aggressive, almost desperate desire for efficiency.
This is where it gets so cool. Duhigg explains that the brain is always looking for ways to save effort. If you picture the human brain as an evolutionary onion, the outer layers, the cerebral cortex, the parts closest to your scalp, they are the most recent additions in human evolution.
Right, the new hardware.
Exactly.
Right.
That is where all your complex thought occurs. When you invent a new recipe, or when you analyze a spreadsheet, or when you laugh at a joke, those outer layers are firing like crazy. But deep, deep down in the center of the brain, right where the brainstem meets the spinal cord, is this little ancient lump of tissue.
About the size of a golf ball.
Right. This is the basal ganglia.
And for a very long time, medical science didn't fully understand what the basal ganglia did. I mean, other than knowing it played a role in degenerative motor diseases like Parkinson's. But in the 1990s, the researchers at MIT started to suspect that this ancient nub of tissue might actually be the command center for our habits.
So they decided to test it.
Yeah. To prove it, they set up these incredibly elaborate micro-laboratories. The environmental control was intense. They kept the rooms at a chilly 60 degrees to ensure the researchers' hands remained perfectly steady during these microscopic surgeries.
That is intense.
Oh, it gets crazier. They implanted sensors, thinner than a human hair, directly into the skulls of rats. They needed to monitor the exact neurological firing patterns while these rats navigated a T-shaped maze with a piece of chocolate placed at the end.
Okay, so visualize this setup. The rat is placed behind a small partition at the start of the maze. The researchers trigger a loud mechanical click, the partition drops open, and the rat wanders out. It sniffs the corners, scratches the walls, turns left, turns right, and eventually finds the chocolate.
Standard maze stuff.
Right. But when the MIT scientists looked at the brain activity monitors during those first few runs, the rat's brain was an absolute fireworks display. It was working frantically the entire time. The outer layers of the brain were processing every single sensory input, every smell, the texture of the floor, the sound of the air vents.
But then, they had the rat run the exact same maze, dozens, then hundreds of times, and something profound happened.
This is the crazy part.
It really is. The rat stopped wandering. It started moving faster, eventually sprinting straight down the corridor and making the correct turn perfectly every single time. Now, that behavioral change was expected.
Garrett learned the maze.
Right. But what shocked the researchers was the brain scan. As the rat perfected the route, the intense activity in those outer conscious layers of the brain almost completely vanished. The brain was literally powering down. The only part of the brain that remained highly active was that tiny golf ball at the center.
The basal ganglia?
Exactly.
That is wild. The basal ganglia was entirely absorbing and storing the habit while the rest of the mind essentially went to sleep.
Huh.
I mean, when you look at the brain activity graph for a well-formed habit, it looks like a valley.
Yep, a massive dip in the middle.
There is a spike of brain activity at the very beginning when the rat hears the click of the partition, and there is another spike at the very end when it finds and eats the chocolate. But in the middle, during the actual complex physical act of running the maze, it's a flat line of mental effort.
Let's break down exactly how that works, because this is the foundational mechanic of all human behavior. The conscious brain uses that initial click the environmental trigger to quickly search its archives and figure out which behavioral script to load.
Right.
Once it identifies the correct script, the conscious mind completely clocks out. It hands the steering wheel entirely over to the basal ganglia.
It's almost like the conscious brain is the CEO, and it's constantly trying to delegate tasks to lower-level management so it can go play golf.
That is a perfect way to look at it. And this is exactly what is happening in your brain when you back a car out of a driveway.
Oh, that's a great example.
Think back to when you were 16 years old and first learning to drive. Backing up was a terrifying, overwhelming task. You had to consciously check the rear view mirror, Then the side mirrors, watch for pedestrians, carefully modulate the pressure of your foot on the brake pedal.
While sweating profusely.
Exactly. You had to calculate the turning radius of the steering wheel. Your cerebral cortex was firing on all cylinders, processing massive amounts of data.
But today, you do all of those complex spatial and physical calculations simultaneously without a single conscious thought. I mean, you can safely back out of your driveway onto a busy street while adjusting the volume on a podcast, drinking coffee, and mentally planning an argument you're going to have at work.
We all do it.
The entire sequence has been perfectly delegated to the basal ganglia.
Right, because if your conscious brain didn't delegate, it would overheat. You see this mechanism break down when we slightly alter the environment, though. Think about brushing your teeth.
Okay.
If you usually brush your teeth at the bathroom sink every morning, your basal ganglia runs that script flawlessly. But if one morning you decide to save time and brush your teeth while standing in the shower, the slight change in environmental context often completely confuses the routine.
Oh yeah, you just stand there staring at the wall.
You might find yourself squeezing the toothpaste awkwardly, or you might drop the brush or brush the same side of your mouth twice. The sensory cues have shifted the water on your back, the lack of a mirror, and because the script doesn't match the environment perfectly, your conscious brain is forced to suddenly wake back up and take control.
But, okay, this brings me back to my earlier pushback. If my conscious brain is constantly powering down and handing control of my body to a primitive lump of cells near my spinal cord, it really does feel like a loss of agency. I mean, if my brain is powering down, does that make me a biological robot? Are we just sleepwalking through our lives?
It feels unsettling, certainly. But evolutionary biologists look at this as the ultimate survival mechanism. The brain consumes an enormous amount of the body's energy. If your prefrontal cortex had to consciously process every single micro decision required just to exist.
Like breathing and walking.
Yeah, which shoe to tie first, the exact angle to hold a toothbrush, the precise jaw movements required to chew your food, you would be completely paralyzed by mental fatigue before you even opened your front door.
That makes sense.
The basal ganglia's ruthless efficiency is precisely what frees up our conscious energy to invent things, to build societies, to solve complex problems. The fatal flaw, however, is that the basal ganglia is completely blind. It lacks a moral compass.
Oh, interesting.
It cannot tell the difference between a productive habit like jogging and a destructive one like smoking. Once the script is written, it just runs the script. We've just covered the basal ganglia and how the brain powers down. But here's what none of that prepares you for. Duhigg's Chapter 4 is where everything most people believe about memory and choice breaks down. That's next.
And this brings us to a part of the research that honestly reads like a medical thriller. I mean, if this purely mechanical view of the brain is true, and the basal ganglia is just blindly running scripts, what happens if the rest of the mind, the part that holds your conscious memories and personality, is completely wiped out?
It's a terrifying hypothetical.
But it's not hypothetical. That is exactly what happened to a man researchers refer to in medical literature as EP, or Eugene Pauly.
Eugene's story is one of the most profound discoveries in the history of neuroscience. In 1992, Eugene contracted viral encephalitis. The virus aggressively attacked his brain, specifically causing severe permanent damage to his medial temporal lobe, which is the area critical for conscious memory formation.
So it just wiped his hard drive?
Basically, yeah. When he finally recovered from the physical illness, his intellect was completely intact. He could still hold a conversation, he retained his vocabulary, but he had entirely lost the ability to form any new declarative memories. He could remember his life prior to 1960 perfectly, but anything that happened after the virus destroyed that tissue was gone within seconds.
It is terrifying to even imagine. Duhigg details how Eugene was introduced to Dr. Larry Squire, who was a leading researcher in the neuroanatomy of memory based in San Diego. Eugene's condition was so severe that he didn't even possess the memory that he had memory loss.
Right.
You could walk into his living room, introduce yourself, chat for a few minutes, leave the room to get a glass of water, and when you walked back in, Eugene would stand up and introduce himself all over again with genuine enthusiasm, having absolutely no recollection that he had just met you 3 minutes prior.
Dr. Squire began studying Eugene, and very quickly, he noticed something highly anomalous. Eugene could not draw a map of his own house. If Dr. Squire asked him, "Eugene, where's the kitchen?" Eugene would look around confused and say he had no idea.
In his own home.
In his own home. He couldn't describe the layout of the home he had lived in for years. Yet, when Eugene needed to use the bathroom during an interview, he wouldn't ask for directions. He would simply stand up, walk purposefully down the hall, turn the correct corner, and open the bathroom door.
I remember reading this part and just stopping cold. How does a man who cannot consciously tell you where his own kitchen is somehow navigate a complex floor plan flawlessly?
Well, Squire realized that while the virus had decimated the medial temporal lobe, it had left the basal ganglia completely untouched. So Squire set up an ingenious experiment to test if the basal ganglia could learn entirely on its own.
Without any memory involvement.
Exactly. The setup was a simple visual test. Dr. Squire presented Eugene with 16 cardboard objects of varying shapes and colors. On the bottom of specific objects, there was a small sticker that said, "Correct." Eugene's task was simply to pick up an object and see if it was the right one.
Which had to be so frustrating for him.
Oh, incredibly frustrating at first, because every single time Eugene sat down at the table to do the test, he had zero memory of ever seeing the cardboard objects before. To his conscious mind, every test was the first test.
But over the course of weeks, this jaw-dropping pattern emerged. Even though Eugene could not consciously remember the previous sessions, his accuracy at picking the correct objects improved dramatically.
It was staggering.
By the 36th day of testing, he was choosing the correct objects 95% of the time. When Dr. Squire asked him, "Eugene, how are you doing this? How do you know which ones to pick?" Eugene looked bewildered. He couldn't articulate it. He just pointed to his head and said, "It's here somehow or another," and the hand goes for it.
The hand goes for it. That phrase is chilling because it perfectly describes a completely unconscious physiological process. Eugene's basal ganglia had learned the visual pattern of the objects entirely outside of his conscious awareness.
It's just doing the math in the background.
Yeah. And to prove unequivocally that this was a mechanical habit and not some miraculous recovery of his conscious memory, Squire changed the parameters of the test just slightly. Instead of presenting the objects one by one and asking Eugene to choose, he put all 16 objects in a pile in front of Eugene and asked him to sort them. Put the correct ones on the left and the incorrect ones on the right.
And Eugene completely froze. He stared at the pile and couldn't do it. The objects made absolutely no sense to him in a pile. Why? Because without the specific environmental sequence of cues, seeing one object presented directly alongside another in a specific order, the habit loop simply wasn't triggered.
The script couldn't load.
Exactly. This proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that habits operate on a completely different neural pathway than declarative memory. You do not need to remember learning a habit for the habit to control your behavior.
And this neurological reality translated to every aspect of his daily life. Eugene would go for a walk around his neighborhood every single morning. If you stopped him on the street and asked him for his home address, he couldn't tell you. But he could navigate his way back home perfectly by following specific, subconscious environmental cues.
Like a specific tree or something.
Right. His basal ganglia would recognize a certain oak tree on a corner or the placement of a specific mailbox, and it would mechanically trigger the command to turn left or right. However, if the city happened to be doing road work and the street looked different, if the cues were disrupted, the habit loop shattered, and Eugene would get completely, hopelessly lost just one block from his own house.
But here is where I think the clinical detachment of the scientific literature sometimes glosses over the brutal human reality. Because, the emotional tragedy of the separation between memory and habit is devastating.
It really is.
Duhigg tells a story in the book about Eugene's daughter visiting. She would come over, spend an hour chatting with him, and then she would leave. Now, Eugene would instantly forget that she had even been there. His conscious memory of the visit was wiped clean. But because she had left in a rush and hadn't said a proper goodbye to him, it triggered an ingrained emotional habit loop in Eugene's basal ganglia.
The anger script.
Yes. For the next hour, Eugene would be furiously angry. He would pace around the house, kicking chairs and cursing. When his wife would ask him, "Eugene, why are you so mad?" he would stop, look confused, and say he didn't know. The memory of the slight was completely gone, but the biological habit of anger was still firing. It just had to burn itself out.
It's a profound observation. It shows that our emotional responses are often just as habitual as tying our shoes.
But doesn't that make us incredibly vulnerable? If our habits are so entirely divorced from our conscious memory, aren't we highly susceptible to being manipulated by our own unremembered emotional reactions? We could be walking around executing anger scripts or anxiety scripts totally blind to why they started.
We are exceptionally vulnerable. That is the exact chilling reality the Eugene Pauly case proved to the scientific community. Habits, whether they are motor skills or emotional cascades, will execute their scripts regardless of whether your conscious mind understands the origin.
It just bypasses our permission entirely.
Exactly. The behavior emerges without our permission. But the silver lining of Larry Squire's exhaustive research is that by studying Eugene, he was able to map the exact anatomy of these invisible scripts. Once you can map the anatomy of a disease, you can begin to design a cure.
Which perfectly transitions us into how we map our own behaviors. Because if we're going to stop being victims to our own basal ganglia, we have to understand the exact components of the trap.
Right. Every single habit, no matter how complex it seems, can be broken down into a rigid three-part neurological sequence. It is an unbending rule of biology. The sequence is a cue, a routine, and a reward. If you ever want to dismantle a destructive habit or build a profitable one, you have to dissect this sequence because it entirely bypasses the prefrontal cortex.
Okay, so let's break that down. Duhigg explains that the cue is the trigger. It is the environmental or emotional flag that tells your brain to drop into automatic mode and signals exactly which behavioral script to load. The routine is a behavior itself, which, as we saw with Eugene, can be a physical action, a mental calculation, or an emotional response.
Yep.
And the reward is the feedback loop. It's the neurological prize that helps your basal ganglia figure out if this particular sequence is worth storing for future use. Over time, as this loop spins over and over, the cue and the reward become so deeply intertwined that they merge.
To see how powerful and manipulative this intertwining can be, you only have to look at the fast food industry. Multi-billion-dollar corporations like McDonald's engineer their entire global business model around exploiting this exact loop.
They are masters at it.
Every element is weaponized. The architecture of the stores is standardized worldwide so that seeing those golden arches acts as a universal visual cue. The employees are trained to say the exact same phrases. But the most insidious engineering happens with the reward. The food itself is meticulously designed to deliver an immediate, intense neurological hit.
People like their French fries.
Take their French fries. They are structurally engineered by food scientists to begin disintegrating the exact millisecond they hit your tongue. Why? To deliver a rapid, frictionless hit of salt and grease straight into your bloodstream.
Which lights up the pleasure centers of your brain like a pinball machine. And your basal ganglia immediately locks in the pattern. You don't consciously sit in your car and decide, I would like to consume the specific nutritional profile of a fast food burger right now.
No.
What actually happens is you are driving home from work, you are emotionally stressed, which acts as an internal cue. You look up and see the golden arches, an external cue. The routine of pulling into the drive-thru takes over automatically because your brain is already anticipating the rapid, reliable physical reward of the salt and fat to soothe the stress. It's a paved road in the brain, and your car just automatically turns down it.
That paved road analogy is exactly what the MIT researchers found when they shifted their studies to primates. They designed an experiment with a monkey named Julio. They placed Julio in a chair in front of a computer monitor. A brightly colored shape would appear on the screen. This was the cue.
Okay.
Julio learned that if he reached out and pulled a lever, the routine, a drop of sweet blackberry juice would travel down a tube directly into his mouth, the reward. At first, Julio was just a monkey in a chair randomly pulling a lever. His brain activity was chaotic. But the moment his brain connected the visual shape to the sugary juice, the habit locked into the basal ganglia.
And what's crazy is the behavioral shift that followed. Once that habit locked in, Julio became completely unnervingly hyper-focused. When the colored shape appeared on the screen, his eyes would lock onto the monitor. He wouldn't look away, no matter what distractions the researchers tried to introduce into the room.
He tried everything.
They could open doors, offer him other food, make loud noises. It didn't matter. The habit loop had him completely captivated. The cue commanded his absolute attention. So we have to pause and ask the really hard question for the listener right now. If these neural pathways are literally, physically etched into the tissues of the basal ganglia, and we know these loops completely bypass our conscious thought, are we just managing a chronic disease of bad decisions?
That's a heavy thought.
It is. If the physical wiring is permanently there, how can anyone ever hope to change a deeply ingrained bad habit? Are we doomed?
That is the exact existential question Dr. Anne Graybiel at MIT tried to answer in her lab. She ran experiments where she manipulated the loop, and she proved that if you remove the reward entirely, the habit doesn't die, it just goes dormant. But the terrifying part is, the moment you reintroduce the cue and the reward, the old habit reemerges instantly, at full strength.
So it's always lurking.
Always. The neural pathway never actually disappears. The code is permanent. However, while you cannot delete the old code, she discovered you can insert new code over the top of it.
Okay, we're halfway, and I need to say something. If you've been nodding along for the last 30 minutes, but you haven't actually written anything down, Chapter 6 is the one that requires action. Duhigg calls it the golden rule of habit change, and when Marcus explains it, you'll understand why most people fail here.
Before we go further, if you want to go deeper on the power of habit, the easiest way is to get the actual audiobook on Audible. You can get it free with an Audible trial. The link is in the description. Here at Deep Dive Audiobook English, we always link the book below so you can go straight to the source.
Seriously, the depth Duhigg goes into is worth every second of your time. So let's unpack this golden rule, because it totally reframes how we look at self-discipline.
The golden rule is the foundational strategy for all successful behavior modification. And the rule states, you can never truly extinguish a bad habit. Trying to delete a habit is a fool's errand. To change a habit, you must keep the old cue, you must deliver the old reward, but you must insert a new routine in the middle.
Which explains so much about why New Year's resolutions fail by February. According to Duhigg, the most common mistake every single one of us makes is trying to destroy a habit by relying on sheer willpower to ignore the cue. You see the donut and you just clench your jaw and try to ignore it.
And it never works.
It doesn't. The basal ganglia is stronger than your jaw. If the environmental cue and the biological desire for the reward remain the same, you cannot fight them. You have to hijack the sequence. You have to shift the middle step.
The book illustrates this hijacking concept brilliantly with the story of Tony Dungy. Dungy is the legendary NFL coach who took over the Tampa Bay Buccaneers when they were one of the worst teams in the league, and later led the Indianapolis Colts to a Super Bowl victory.
He's a legend.
When Dungy took over, he didn't come in and hand his players a massive new playbook filled with complex, conscious strategies. He understood a fundamental truth about high-stress environments. In a split-second NFL play, conscious thinking equals hesitation, and hesitation loses games.
Right. Dungy had this amazing philosophy. He told his players, champions don't do extraordinary things. They do ordinary things, but they do them without thinking. He analyzed the existing cues the defensive players were already looking at. When the ball is snapped, a defensive lineman looks at the stance of the opposing lineman, the angle of the tight end, the position of the quarterback's feet.
His cues were already there.
Those visual cues were already ingrained in their brains. And the reward was already there, making the tackle, winning the game, getting the massive paycheck.
So Dungy ignored the cues and the rewards. He solely attacked the routine. He systematically retrained their automatic physical reactions to those specific visual cues. Instead of a player's conscious brain trying to process 10 different variables before deciding which direction to move, Dungy trained them to react instantly to just 2 specific visual cues with a new, simplified physical movement.
Just bypassing the overthinking.
Exactly. By keeping the cues exactly the same and the reward exactly the same, he hijacked their existing habit loops. He just swapped out the middle step.
We see this exact same architectural swap in addiction recovery, which Duhigg explores in depth. He looks at Alcoholics Anonymous. When you strip away the spiritual components of AA, functionally, it is a giant, highly effective machine for swapping out routines.
This is entirely what it is mechanically.
Someone who struggles with alcohol addiction usually drinks because of a specific identifiable cue. Maybe the cue is work-related stress or crippling social anxiety, or a deep desire for connection and relief from isolation. The reward of drinking alcohol is a temporary numbing of that stress, a feeling of escape, or a false sense of social lubrication.
AA does not try to tell people to stop seeking relief or connection. That would be impossible. Those are fundamental human needs. Instead, the program provides a new routine. When the cue of stress or crushing loneliness hits, instead of the routine of going to a bar and ordering a drink, the new routine is going to an AA meeting, or picking up the phone and calling a sponsor.
That makes perfect sense.
The person still gets the reward, they get emotional relief, they get a feeling of connection, they escape their isolation. But the deeply destructive routine of drinking has been swapped out for a constructive routine of community support.
And we see the same pattern with smokers trying to quit. If you smoke to relieve tension at work, the cue is the feeling of tension, and the reward is a chemical distraction and a physical break from your desk. If you want to quit, wearing a nicotine patch often isn't enough because it doesn't address the loop.
You're just masking it.
Right. You have to identify a new routine that delivers a similar distraction when the tension hits. Maybe the new routine is dropping to the floor and doing 20 push-ups, or chewing a piece of intensely flavored nicotine gum. or literally just stepping outside for 3 minutes to do deep breathing exercises. The structural integrity of the loop remains intact, but you've replaced the tobacco with oxygen.
That's a great way to summarize it.
But let me play devil's advocate here. It sounds incredibly elegant on paper. Keep the cue, keep the reward, swap the routine. It's a neat little equation. But swapping routine in the real world when you are exhausted or panicked is incredibly hard. What happens when the pressure is truly on?
It's the hardest part.
In a personal crisis, a divorce, a job loss, a death in the family, people almost always default to their oldest, most destructive habits. A new routine like doing push-ups or calling a sponsor feels incredibly fragile compared to a 20-year habit of drinking.
You're absolutely right to challenge that, and the clinical data backs you up. The research shows that replacing the routine works perfectly in controlled environments, but under immense, unpredictable stress, the new routine often shatters. The brain panics and reaches for the oldest, deepest pathway.
So how do we fix that?
This is where a critical non-mechanical element comes in: belief. Duhigg argues that for a new habit to permanently stick under pressure, the individual fundamentally has to believe that change is possible. And interestingly, the data shows that this kind of resilient belief almost never forms in isolation. It only crystallizes in the context of a group or a community.
So that's why the group meetings work.
Exactly. Seeing others succeed creates the belief that your new routine will hold.
Which perfectly sets up the next crucial element, because even if you know the golden rule, and even if you have a community, the loop won't spin on its own. It needs fuel.
Exactly, and that fuel is the psychological engine driving the entire mechanism.
So let's talk about that engine. Let's dig into the power of craving.
The profound realization in this part of the research is that simply having a cue and a reward is not enough to make a habit last long-term. The habit loop only spins automatically when a neurological craving is cultivated. The brain has to start actively anticipating the reward before the routine even happens.
Duhigg points out that craving is the glue that makes a habit stick permanently. It is a biological, chemical anticipation. To understand how visceral this is, let's go back to Julio the monkey in the MIT lab. Remember, the sequence was set. The cue was the colored shape on the screen, the routine was pulling the lever, and the reward was the drop of blackberry juice.
The MIT researchers weren't just watching Julio, they were monitoring the exact neurochemical spikes in his brain. Initially, when Julio was first learning the sequence, his brain spiked with pleasure after the juice hit his tongue. The pleasure was a reaction to the reward.
Right.
But as the habit became deeply ingrained over weeks of repetition, the brain activity shifted backward in time. The exact millisecond Julio saw the colored shape on the screen, his brain spiked with pleasure, anticipating the juice long before he even reached for the lever. The visual cue triggered a chemical craving.
And here's where the mechanics of craving get truly wild. The researchers decided to mess with the reward. Sometimes Julio would see the shape, pull the lever, but no juice would come out, or the juice would be watered down. When that happened, Julio didn't just casually walk away or look confused. He got visibly, violently angry. He would shriek, bare his teeth, and throw things around the cage. Because his brain had already spiked with the anticipation of pleasure, denying the reward caused what neuroscientists call a prediction error. The craving was so strong that when it wasn't met, it caused a neurological tantrum.
That craving, that anticipatory spike of dopamine and the subsequent crash, if denied, is the invisible engine of the habit loop. It explains so many irrational human behaviors. It is exactly why you can walk past a box of donuts in the office break room, feeling completely full from lunch, but suddenly feel an overwhelming, almost physical urge to eat one.
I've definitely been there.
You weren't hungry a moment before, but your brain saw the visual cue, the pink box, and instantly started anticipating the massive sugar hit.
And the really terrifying part is that massive corporations understand this neurochemistry perfectly, and they use it against us. Consider Cinnabon. Duhigg explains how they strategically locate their stores in the middle of enclosed shopping malls or deep inside airport terminals. Why? Because they want the intense scent of cinnamon and baking sugar to drift through the hallways.
It's basically a trap.
Long before you even see the store logo, that scent enters your nostrils and acts as an invisible cue. Your basal ganglia recognizes the smell and starts aggressively anticipating the warm, sugary dough. By the time you physically turn a corner and see the Cinnabon kiosk, that craving is a roaring monster inside your head. You reach for your wallet without even making a conscious decision.
It's behavioral engineering at its finest. A brilliant historical example of this is the advertising executive Claude Hopkins. In the early 1900s, dental hygiene in America was abysmal. Barely anyone brushed their teeth. Hopkins was tasked with selling a new product called Pepsodent toothpaste. He knew he couldn't just tell people to brush. He needed to create a habit loop.
So he went looking for a cue.
He scoured medical textbooks and found a cue, the natural mucin film that builds up on human teeth. He told the public to run their tongue over their teeth to feel the film. But more importantly, he engineered a specific reward. Pepsodent contained mint oil, citric acid, and chemicals that created a cool, tingling sensation on the gums.
And this is the ultimate manipulation. That tingle did absolutely nothing to actually clean the teeth. It had zero antibacterial properties. It was purely a cosmetic irritant, but it created a craving. People began to deeply associate clean teeth with that specific tingling sensation.
It's all about the feeling.
If they brushed their teeth with a different powder and didn't feel the tingle, they felt their mouth was still dirty. Hopkins cultivated a physical craving for a completely artificial sensation, and in the process, he essentially invented global dental hygiene. But wait, I need to stop us here. If corporations like Cinnabon and McDonald's and toothpaste companies are literally weaponizing my basal ganglia with engineered scents, disintegrating fries, and chemical tingles, isn't the game rigged against the individual? It feels like we are completely outgunned by neuromarketing. They have billions of dollars in research, and I just have a tired prefrontal cortex at the end of a long workday.
It is heavily stacked against the individual. There is no denying that. The environment is engineered to extract your attention and your money. But awareness is what levels the playing field. Once you understand that the craving you feel is not a genuine need, but a mechanical neurochemical response to a specific engineered cue, you can dissect it.
So you step outside the loop.
You can observe the craving instead of instantly obeying it. You can recognize that the roaring monster is just a spike in dopamine anticipation, not an absolute command from your soul. And once you see the cue for what it is, you can intentionally insert a different routine. 6 insights in. Here's what I want you to sit with for the next 10 minutes. Every single thing we've covered connects to one idea. We haven't named it yet. Chapter 9 is where it lands.
Before we get to that synthesis, we have to look at how we scale this, because trying to change every single habit in your life one by one sounds exhausting.
Exactly, which is why Duhigg introduces the concept of keystone habits. The reality is that not all habits are created equal. Certain habits possess a disproportionate power. These are known as keystone habits, and shifting just one of them causes a biological and psychological domino effect. Shifting a single keystone habit can spontaneously reshape entire organizational structures or dramatically overhaul a personal life.
I love this concept. Duhigg argues that you do not need to meticulously micromanage and change every single behavior in your life to see massive transformation. You just need to identify the 1 or 2 habits that create leverage. I think of keystone habits like the load-bearing wall in a house renovation. You don't have to demolish the entire house to change the floor plan.
That's exactly,
You just identify the load-bearing wall, and when you reinforce it or shift it, the entire structural integrity of the house changes around it. When you change a keystone habit, it fundamentally shifts your self-image and creates a scaffolding that naturally supports other positive changes.
The most dramatic, large-scale example of this in the book is the story of Paul O'Neill taking over as the CEO of Alcoa, the aluminum company of America, in October 1987. At the time, Alcoa was struggling immensely. Profits were down, the unions were striking, the workforce was demoralized, and their product quality was slipping.
It was a mess.
When O'Neill was introduced to Wall Street investors and analysts at a fancy Manhattan hotel, they expected him to deliver the standard corporate jargon. They wanted to hear about profit margins, synergy, cutting costs, and restructuring management.
And I have to interrupt right here, because if I'm a Wall Street investor and the company is tanking and the new CEO stands up and says his only priority is worker safety, I would think he was delusional. It sounds like a terrible soft strategy for a failing manufacturing giant. And that's exactly what the investors thought. They literally ran out of the room to use the payphones to tell their clients to sell Alcoa stock immediately. They thought he was a naive hippie who didn't understand the ruthless reality of business.
From the outside, it looked like corporate suicide. But O'Neill was operating on a different level. He understood organizational habits. He knew he couldn't just walk in and order a demoralized company to suddenly become more efficient or profitable. That would just create resentment. He had to attack one specific routine that would forcefully disrupt everything else. Worker safety was his load-bearing wall.
His keystone habit.
It was a keystone habit. Because to achieve his stated goal of 0 injuries, Alcoa had to fundamentally restructure how it communicated at every single level.
It's a brilliant Trojan horse, because if a worker got hurt on the factory floor, O'Neill mandated that the floor manager had to report it directly to the plant president within 24 hours, along with a detailed plan to ensure it never happened again. In order to meet that strict 24-hour deadline, the plant manager had to have a direct, frictionless line of communication to the highest executives. This mandate forcefully collapsed the rigid, bureaucratic corporate hierarchy. Suddenly, communication channels were wide open.
And it went further. Because they were constantly analyzing why accidents happened, they started discovering other inefficiencies. To prevent a molten metal spill, they had to fix a faulty machine. When they fixed the faulty machine, production sped up. To prevent workers from getting exhausted and making mistakes, they changed the shift schedules. When they changed the schedules, morale improved.
It just snowballed.
The relentless pursuit of safety inadvertently modernized and streamlined the entire manufacturing pipeline. Within a single year, Alcoa's profits hit a record high. By the time O'Neill retired, the company's market capitalization had increased by $27 billion. By focusing intensely on one single keystone habit, he completely revolutionized the corporate culture.
And this isn't just for billion-dollar corporations. We see this leverage on an individual level, too. Consider the simple act of food tracking. The National Institutes of Health funded a massive weight loss study. They found that when people were asked to keep a daily food journal, just writing down what they ate at least one day a week, it acted as an incredibly powerful keystone habit. The simple, seemingly mundane act of recording their food created a new level of mindfulness.
It acts as an observational tool. Suddenly, people who track their food start noticing their own unconscious loops. They realize, oh, I automatically eat a bag of chips at 3 p.m. every single day, not because I'm hungry, but because I'm stressed at work.
It forces awareness.
That sudden awareness almost always bleeds over into other areas. They start naturally planning healthier meals to avoid writing down bad ones. Planning meals leads to feeling better physically, which leads to better sleep, which leads to naturally wanting to exercise more. None of those secondary behaviors were prescribed by the researchers. They emerged organically as a domino effect from the single keystone habit of journaling.
Or look at elite athletes. Duhigg explores Michael Phelps, the greatest Olympic swimmer in history. His coach, Bob Bowman, didn't just focus on swimming technique or weightlifting. He instilled a keystone mental habit called watching the videotape. Every night before falling asleep and every morning upon waking, Phelps would visualize the perfect race in his mind. He would imagine the exact smell of the chlorine, the feeling of the water dripping off his cap, the exact number of strokes.
That daily mental visualization built an incredibly dense, strong neural pathway in his basal ganglia. So when he actually got in the water for the Olympic finals, surrounded by millions of screaming fans, his basal ganglia just loaded and ran the script he had visualized thousands of times. It kept his heart rate calm under immense pressure. And that discipline of visualization cascaded into intense discipline regarding his physical diet and his training schedule.
This all brings us to the culmination of Duhigg's research, the overarching philosophy of how we manage our own minds in light of these mechanics.
This is the synthesis. This is the thread that connects the T. Mays, Eugene Pauly, Julio the Monkey, and Paul O'Neill. Every single insight we've explored comes back to the same root truth. Your behavior matters infinitely more than your knowledge. And once you understand the machinery of the habit loop, you become ethically and practically responsible for it.
This is a heady shift. The knowledge of how the basal ganglia works is not just fun academic trivia for a cocktail party. It fundamentally shifts the moral weight of our actions. To highlight this tension between biology and personal responsibility, Duhigg contrasts two extreme, deeply tragic legal cases. We have to look at them objectively, not to preach, but to understand how society views the brain.
The first case involves a man from Wales named Brian Thomas. Thomas suffered from severe, clinically documented sleep terrors. This is a condition where the brain's primitive areas, the brainstem and the basal ganglia, remain highly active, executing physical movements, while the conscious, rational mind is entirely asleep.
Okay.
One night, while on vacation in a camper van with his wife, Thomas had a vivid, terrifying night terror that an intruder had broken in and was attacking her. While completely unconscious, running purely on primitive brainstem reflexes, he strangled his wife to death.
It is a genuinely horrifying story. He woke up moments later, realized what his body had done, and immediately called the police, completely devastated. During the trial, neuroscientists testified that Thomas had absolutely zero conscious control over his actions. He was literally acting on an automatic, unconscious neurological reflex. He was asleep.
Right.
The jury, after hearing the neurological evidence, acquitted him. Society, through the legal system, recognized that a human being cannot be held responsible for a purely unconscious biological process that they have no awareness of.
Now contrast that tragic reflex with the case of Angie Bachman. Bachman was a housewife who developed a severe, debilitating gambling addiction. Over several years, she lost everything, her family's entire life savings, their house, and she accrued massive, crippling debts to Ross Casino.
A completely different scenario.
When the casino eventually sued her for the unpaid debt, her defense lawyers tried to use the exact same biological argument as Brian Thomas's lawyers. They argued that the casino had purposefully and maliciously weaponized her habit loops. They sent her free sweets, free booze, and targeted coupons, perfectly triggering her cues and cravings until her basal ganglia took over. She claims she was biologically compelled to gamble and therefore had no control, just like a sleepwalker.
But the state Supreme Court flatly rejected her argument. They pointed out a crucial defining difference between her and the sleepwalker. Bachman was fully awake and aware she had a problem. Furthermore, the state had a voluntary exclusion program, a list where problem gamblers could legally bar themselves from entering casinos.
She had an out.
Exactly. If she had put her name on that list, the casino would have been legally forbidden from letting her in. Bachman knew about her habits, she knew how it worked, she knew she was destroying her family, and yet during moments of conscious clarity, she failed to take the steps to intervene. Society punished her, holding her liable for the debt, while acquitting the sleepwalker.
And that legal distinction is the exact crux of Duhigg's entire synthesis. If you do not know a habit exists, if you are literally unconscious of it, you are a victim of your biology. But the moment you understand how the habit loop works, the moment you can identify the cue, the routine, and the reward you cross an invisible threshold, you are no longer just a passive passenger in your own body. You have the mechanical knowledge to intervene, which means you now bear the absolute responsibility to change it.
Duhigg quotes the great philosopher and psychologist William James, who wrote extensively about habits over a century ago. James said we must make our nervous system our ally instead of our enemy. He wrote about doing things with immense difficulty the first time, but doing them over and over until they become semi-mechanical.
Think about what your life looks like if you ignore this machinery. If you close this audio and change nothing, you will spend the next decade fighting the exact same invisible urges. You will constantly burn through your finite willpower, and you will inevitably default to the routines engineered by fast food companies, app developers, and casinos. You will be a rat in someone else's maze.
But now, imagine what happens when you actively manipulate your own habit loops. You do the hard work of reprogramming the middle step. You wake up 5 years from now, and the math of your life is finally working for you, not against you. Your health, your financial savings, your daily productivity, they're all running on semi-mechanical scripts that you deliberately, consciously designed. The heavy lifting of your life is being done automatically by your basal ganglia. But wait, I have to ask, doesn't this mean Aristotle was right? Aristotle famously said we are what we repeatedly do. If our entire lives, our successes and our failures are just a collection of these ingrained neurological loops, are we really nothing but our habits? Where is the humanity, the soul, in that equation?
The humanity doesn't disappear. It elevates. The humanity lies entirely in the awareness. Yes, biologically, we are a collection of habits, but unlike a rat or a monkey or any other creature on Earth, we possess a prefrontal cortex that gives us the capacity to observe our own programming. A rat in a maze will run toward the chocolate until it dies of exhaustion. A human being can recognize the walls of the maze, identify the mechanical click of the partition, analyze the neurochemistry of the chocolate, and consciously decide to build a completely different maze.
That is incredibly empowering. It takes the mystery out of failure, which leads us perfectly into the final practical step: how to actually start building that new maze today.
Let's get into the protocol.
We are going to distill this entire hour of complex neuroscience into a highly specific 4-step diagnostic protocol that you can apply right now. Let's use Duhigg's own personal example from the book. He had a bad habit of eating a chocolate chip cookie at the New York Times cafeteria every single afternoon at exactly 3:00 p.m., which was causing him to gain weight.
A classic habit loop.
Action 1 is to identify the routine. This is usually the easiest part because it's the behavior you are unhappy with. What is the actual action you want to change? In Duhigg's case, the routine was getting up from his desk, walking down to the cafeteria, buying the cookie, and eating it while gossiping with his colleagues.
So that's the middle step.
Right. Action 2 is to experiment with rewards. This takes time. You need to figure out what underlying craving is actually driving the behavior. When you go for that cookie, are you truly craving a massive hit of sugar? Or are you just bored with your spreadsheet and craving a temporary distraction? Or are you craving the social interaction of gossiping with your coworkers?
You have to isolate the variable.
Exactly. To find out, the next time the urge hits, you have to deliberately change the reward. One day, go for a walk around the block instead of going to the cafeteria. The next day, go to the cafeteria, buy an apple, and eat it at your desk. The next day, go to a colleague's desk and chat for 5 minutes without any food involved. After each experiment, ask yourself 15 minutes later, am I still craving that cookie? By testing different rewards, you isolate exactly what your basal ganglia is actually seeking.
And once you know the reward, you find the trigger.
Action 3 is to isolate the cue. Our daily lives are incredibly noisy, so identifying the specific trigger is very hard. But research shows almost all habitual cues fit into one of 5 distinct categories: location, time, emotional state, other people, or the immediately preceding action. So track it like a scientist. For 3 days, write down, where are you when the urge hits? What exact time is it? How do you feel emotionally? Who is in the room with you? What did you just finish doing? When Duhigg tracked it, he realized his cue wasn't hunger or stress. It was simply the time of day. The urge hit like clockwork at 3:30 p.m.
Which brings us to the final step.
Action 4 is to have a plan. Once you know the cue and the reward, you rewrite the code. Write down the exact formula on a piece of paper. When this cue happens, I will do this new routine because it provides this reward. For Duhigg's cookie habit, his new written plan became, at 3:30 p.m. every day, I will stand up, walk to a friend's desk, and talk for 10 minutes. He kept the time cue, he kept the social reward of gossiping, but he successfully eliminated the destructive routine of eating a cookie.
Exactly. It requires deliberate, conscious practice for the first few weeks, but the neurology absolutely guarantees that the new routine will eventually overwrite the old impulse. The basal ganglia will learn the new code.
If this breakdown hit differently today and gave you a completely new lens on your own behavior, make sure you subscribe or follow the channel so you don't miss the next one, and I want you to drop a comment below right now. Which of these insights about the brain surprised you the most? Was it the rat's brain powering down in the T-maze? Or the devastating reality of Eugene Pauly's story? Or the Cinnabon scent trap? Let us know down there. Then stick around, because our next deep dive is going even further into behavioral psychology, and you definitely won't want to miss it.
It's going to be a good one.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to chew on. We've spent this entire time talking about how you can map your own basal ganglia. But think about the world we live in today. If researchers in the 90s could map a monkey's cravings, what do you think the algorithms running your social media feeds are doing right now? With every scroll, every pause, every click, artificial intelligence is mapping your personal habit loops with terrifying precision. If you don't take the time to consciously program your own cues and rewards, I promise you there's an algorithm out there that is more than happy to do it for you.
That is a chilling thought to end on.
Diagnosis is always murky when it comes to the human brain, but Charles Duhigg has handed us the blueprint to the black box. The machinery of choice is sitting right there waiting for you to program it. That's a wrap on another deep dive. This is Deep Dive Audiobook English. We'll see you on the next upload.